School here in Philadelphia. And I slipped and almost said Springfield because I saw two of my librarian and former teacher from Springfield this morning. I was happy to see them. Let's see, I was the kid that you did not want in your classroom. And so it's really good to be here to have this conversation and talk about the role that I serve, or the role that I played in helping to move South Philadelphia High School today. South Philly was a school that was under tremendous turmoil a little over 5 years ago. This is my 5th year at South Philly. There were a well-covered racial incident that took place at the school, and the principal was removed, and it was just insane. So when I came to the district, Chris I met pretty early on, and we just started having really smart conversations. And I said, okay, I like this guy, and thankfully he liked me back. And and we've just been talking about education in schools and how do you connect kids to different resources, to different pathways, talking about teaching and learning, the roles that teachers play in the development of students and creating culture in schools. So it's just a pleasure to be here, and look forward to this conversation.
Thank you very much. So a quick question to you all. How many here have made new connections at EduCon? Excellent. And how many have learned new techniques to bring different kinds of ways to communicate back? Oh, that's great to see it. So thank you for that. You have another whole day. Keep making those connections. They're so valuable. We're going to drill down a little bit on the education level today, but I would start with a rather large question, which is, so what is the role of culture in making connections? And I thought maybe we could start. I'd love to invite the other panelists to chime in, if that's okay.
Sure. Well, I know I'm talking to an audience of educators, so I want to flip the script a little bit. I'm going to ask you all to take down something for me. There are 3 books on this issue of culture that I think every teacher and administrator should read. They are Beverly Tatum's Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, Lisa Delpit, Other People's Children, and Sarah Lightfoot, The Essential Conversation, What Parents and Teachers Can Learn from Each Other. I think that all 3 of those books are mandatory reading because they create a foundation for really helping teachers understand how to interact with children of color, how to interact with parents of color, and how to teach children of color. So moving to the parents. We know in parent involvement that there are many factors that influence parent engagement, and those include race and culture and social class and ethnic background. And we also know that those factors are greatly influenced by how teachers and schools interact with parents of color and the generalizations that they make about parents of color. We look at data and we can see that for the most part, by and large, parents of color are not treated as equal partners in schools. Parents of color are also more likely to be in schools that are under-resourced and underperforming. And they care about their children, but that often is lost because parent involvement is very much structured in a very narrow Eurocentric view of what parent involvement should be. I served as the vice president of my son's PTA when he was in elementary school, and it was a Title I school. We had a very high population of immigrants from Central America and Africa. I was inundated every time I would go to the school with complaints about parents don't return memorandum, they don't sign things, they don't return our calls, they don't come to meetings. What time is your meeting? 3:30, okay? What about the fact, do we know that these parents speak English? No. Yet, somehow that was translated to the parents either uncaring or being disinterested. Rather than looking at what schools could do to be more creative in engaging those parents, there's also a real issue in non-white communities as far as how parents view public education. I'm going to say something shocking. They don't like you. Many of them have had negative experiences in schools. They walk around with these experiences. They then have children, and their children are now in schools where I think in the essential conversation, she says, parents come to schools bearing the haunts of early experiences. So you think about that, and then you have to think about what can educators do to break down those obstacles. They're not insurmountable, but it does require you to interact with parents of color in a much different way. I've looked at around the country at different examples. There are schools where they will bring parents in to learn English, to do English lessons. They'll do dinners where they bring their children into the school. They read with their children. There are many different things that you can do, but it just requires you to think about it in a much broader way, in a much more inclusive way. And it also requires you to think about our communities differently, because difference doesn't mean disinterest.
So I want to maybe, could we jump to Otis, to your story about how you worked within the culture of your community to heal what was happening there in South Philadelphia? Is that
Okay, let me try to give you a very short version of a very tumultuous road. So when I took over South Philadelphia High, so let me give you a description. South Philadelphia High School, for those of you that are not familiar with the area, we're located on Broad Street, Broad and Snyder, pretty much the heart of South Philadelphia. I have about 800 students right now. I get a new student every day. I get new students every single day. And on many days, I get 2 or 3. And when I took over South Philadelphia High School, at the time, my school is 30% special ed, about 20% ELL. And we had to work really hard to deal with the issues with the, more specifically, the Asian immigrant population. There were some attacks that took place at the school, and like I said, that was well documented. The first thing that I had to do when I took over the school was really just reach out to the community. And one of the things that I did was that summer before I started, I would reach out to different groups and I would call them and say, I want to meet with you. And they say, okay, Principal Hackney, when do you want to meet with us? When do you want us to come to the school? I said, no, I will come to wherever you are, wherever you're most comfortable. So I went to various communities, and I would get out of my car, and you feel like you're transplanted to another part of the world because you're the only one, that is like, okay, I might have been the only person born here. And you walk into buildings and you're talking to folks and you're trying to figure out what can we do to fix the climate and culture around South Philadelphia High School. And as I tell anyone, and if I talk to any young principal or whatever, I said, your first job is to listen more than you speak. Listen, just listen to the people. They will tell you what's wrong. And so sometimes they could tell me what was wrong in 5 minutes. Some people took 45 minutes to actually get to the point. But you're going to sit there and ask, but I'll listen for 45 minutes. Because then as I'm listening, I'm identifying the places of frustration versus what's just venting, and keying on those areas of frustration. And one of the most simple things you do is just, as a school leader, if there's something I can fix with, the stroke of a pen or a simple keystroke, you do it. And people are so happy when you do that. Students are happy, parents are happy, teachers are happy, because this was something there was a change that you could make overnight. And so you just do it. And it doesn't cost you anything. You don't lose any political capital. You don't lose anything in the eyes of your school community to make that happen. If anything, you gain points. Yeah. And so it's always looking at how do you gain that capital that you need, so that way when you hit that rough road, you're able to say, you know what, I need to spend some of that right now. I need some help. So, last year, one of the things and it wasn't an event that we hosted at South Philadelphia High School, that people, 4 years ago or 5 years ago would have never imagined it happened, is like, the Vietnamese Association held their annual Lunar New Year celebration in the gymnasium of South Philadelphia High School. And those of you that followed the story and how significant that was. I mean, we had 1,000 people in our gym on a Sunday morning in February. But the most disappointing part was there was very little media coverage. We put it out there, And it was just like, you covered it when kids were getting beat up, and you talked about who were the good kids and who was bad and the boycott. But here we are, and if you looked at the volunteers, it was a cross-section of kids that worked as volunteers to help get the program running, and it was very, very little media coverage. But and we're hosting it again, actually. It's coming up in a couple weeks, again at South Philadelphia High School. But it was just those little small steps and changes that we made, bless you, that we made at the school to help get to the point where we could have an event like that, where student groups meet, or outside agencies meet with students after school on a regular basis, and they're welcome to do so. And I said, you can be critical, you can tell me things that we need to do to improve the school, and meeting with them and talking to them. But once again, just listening. Listen, take action, and that just helps bring about climate and change with the school in partnership with the community.
Thank you, Otis. And Vanessa, you wanted to chime in?
I actually had a follow-up question to our panel on that.
Okay.
Now, I've heard solutions and brainstorming around how to bridge cultures, including support and listening. And listening is such an important part of connecting folks together, connected learning. So I wanted to ask folks what you think listening means, and what your protocol for listening is, especially when you're talking to parents, when you're talking to students. At this point in online learning, I think, personally, I think of, a friend of mine refers to a process kind of like the Matrix. When something says something I don't understand, I sort of like bend backwards and like think about all of my different concepts of what they might mean, and mapping ideas to what I've seen before and patterns. So I was wondering what listening meant to you folks in the context of building culture.
Who wants to take that one?
Well, I think that was interesting. One of the things that I was thinking about in this conversation, which has already been really moving, I think, is this notion of culture. It's not a thing. It's not like a bag. Mm-hmm. Like, I put culture in this bag, and over in this bag I put something else. Culture is the whole web of meaning mm-hmm. that human beings enact with each other. Yeah. Culture is human meaning. The color red is just a wavelength, but when it's on a stop sign or a light, and we give it meaning, you must stop, and then we give it a narrative, good drivers stop on red, mm-hmm. we're actually building culture together. And when we work together to do anything, we're actually making culture, which means culture's making us, but we're also human beings making and can remake culture. So the listening piece, so how does listening, which sounds very consuming in some ways, how does listening fit in? But we always have that thought, active listening. Yeah. So active listening is actually a way of also projecting meaning. Yeah. So simply sitting for 45 minutes and having people talk is not silence in a way. It's actually sending a message. It's participating in creating meaning. And so I think for people who want to feel they've been heard, active listening, real listening, authentic listening, is a huge part of having people feel like they're not just talking in your face, but being heard. So I think I would take up in the face-to-face world, we have so many cues to give each other that we are listening actively. We can create a kind of interpersonal space that can really advance authentic connection. I think good teachers have, perhaps in a tacit way, a lot of those cues. I mean, you just sort of see them at work, maybe completely silently, and you know that a community has been built where people feel heard. Mm-hmm. How do we do that online, which was part of your question? How do we move it into another realm where we have more opportunity for connection, more opportunity to talk to people at a distance and with difference and bring ideas in? How do we communicate listening in a place where we're actually physically not present? What's the drama? What's the action that you can take? I'm guessing there's some piece that any of us, but you, Vanessa, might speak to too, about kind of skilled moderation and facilitation that makes some online spaces be profound connections and some be like superficial and absolutely. Throwaway space.
And yeah, that's interesting. Do you want to let go?
So I guess the question you raised in terms of like protocol. I don't necessarily have a protocol for listening, but I can kind of give you an idea of when I'm listening, how I conceptualize what do I need to do to support this parent or community activist or whatever, because in the end, it's about supporting the child or my student. And so I was a math teacher. And so when I go here for my math folks, you'll be able to keep up. Some of you, if you don't like linear algebra and matrices, you're not gonna like this. But when I think of a child, I think of the child in terms of an equation, a multivariate equation. And each term is some significant aspect of their life. And each term has a coefficient. That coefficient measures the importance of that aspect of that student's life. So when we talk about race, class, gender, socioeconomic background, neighborhood, each one of those terms that is assigned a coefficient. So for some people, gender is very important. So that might be a coefficient of like 100. For some people, gender's not that big a deal. They've figured out how to navigate the world or whatever, and gender doesn't matter, and so that's like, 0.1. For race, maybe huge coefficient, and I'm not even talking about the exponential aspect of this, right? Maybe that value of that coefficient to that factor, to that particular term, may be huge. And so if you think about a child in all these different categories that they have and assign what I'm listening for, what's important, what are you valuing right now? So I think about all those different aspects to that person. That's what I need to key on for that individual. The tough part about being a principal is I have an 800 line matrix, right? It's like 800, and I have to figure that out and navigate those personalities and people, let alone the teachers and parents. But if I just think about the kids, I have like 800 of them, and I'm trying to figure them out simultaneously. So when you made your reference to the matrix, I said, that's how I think that way all the time. And I'm dodging too, but I'm actually trying to manipulate this matrix. And so when I'm listening, what is important to this child? So when I have ELL students and they're new to the country, that cultural piece, language, that's an important factor to their success. Because they may be well educated, but they speak very little English. So they're trying to just navigate a new world. Then that means, okay, when I think about that child within that community and other students like that child, because at least luckily I can group some together and say, okay, you know what? This is important for them. This is what I need to do. This is what's important for this group over here. That's what I need to do for them. Then you still comes down to, like I said, little individual students, and I have to figure out, okay, well, you have several factors that I need to consider. And how do I make this work? So, like I said, if you're a math person, you get it. It's tough. It's really, really tough, but you have to really process it in a manner that works for you. So that's what works for me, right? I couldn't be an English major, trust me. But as a math person, that's just how I see it. And it's not to just boil a kid down to an equation, but if that's what makes me work so that way it raises my level of effectiveness, then that's how I do it. So you just have to take an approach that works for you, and you really have to understand how you think, and then thinking about your value set, but assigning a value set to that student and their individual needs, so that way you can provide the support that they need.
Right.
But you've just given the best advertisement for cultural competence, right? Because the ability to be able to do that and to look at a student and all of those different factors, and I'm not a math person, but
you get it.
so I'm not
Right.
even going to
But you get it.
repeat the things
Right.
you said, but to be able to do that, you have to have a certain skill that allows you to be able to target and identify children that way. And you can't be colorblind, right? And you can't
Right.
look at children and say, well, I'm a good teacher, and so I can teach anything, and that I don't really need to teach race because I teach English, or I teach math, or I teach chemistry, when in fact, no, you're teaching a child. And for you not to teach a child at that level, you're pretty much erasing the child. You're erasing the whole child and who they represent.
It was weird, I'm sorry, but just real quick, it was weird to think about that. Some people thought some of my success at South Philadelphia High School, because I guess the shape of my eyes or something, they thought, well, maybe he's part Asian. And I said, not from the part of West Philly where I'm from. No. I said, but it's just, if you care about the people that I say it that I serve. They don't serve me, I serve them. So I just care about my kids. So and after a while, when you talk about, well, what do you need to do this way, that, what is your level of care? Do you really care and value the people that you work with or the children that you serve? If you really don't, or you have some disdain at whatever level for them, it always comes through. I had a very smart educator once told me, he said, the kids may not be able to read, but they can read you.
That's great.
And that was Woolworth Davis. And if you know Woolworth, he was a principal here in the district. And he said that one day in the meeting, and I never forgot it. And so if you understand that aspect and you care, now if that statement has meaning to you, it's very powerful. If it doesn't, then you just dismiss and say, well, I don't care, I'm just continue to do what I'm doing. So, I mean, that's really scary.
Yeah. And Vanessa, I know you wanted to say something.
Oh, I wanted to jump in with the kinds of, I really liked this discussion of listening for what's important to a person. In an online context, and PDPU is working on a number of projects right now to connect teachers and parents and students and sort of bridge this gap in understanding around technology and kids think they learn versus how parents think their kids learn. And something that we're realizing is something to get past is that a lot of kids come into an online context with, there are a couple different roles. One is the peacock. Like students are, they really want to brag about what they're doing. And then there's also, there's the lurker, right? So something that PDPU does, and we're trying to do this amongst parents and teachers and learners, is we start with playful vulnerability as a way to build culture. And an example of that is a workshop I did yesterday called How to Be a Gentleman in the 21st Century. And I went around and I asked people, when is the last time you had a crisis in gentlemanliness? And so that's how I try to think about accelerating intimacy and accelerating authenticity, is starting with this sort of playful vulnerability. But I wondered if there were other people on the panel who had strategies for building culture of vulnerability and listening as well.
Online and in person. I mean, I'm curious about their experiences in listening in person versus listening digitally. And as you said, it's a very different dynamic, but both have value. So I'm curious about.
Then I might follow up and I might say that in an online community, I think people really quickly learn that if you don't listen, no one will listen to you. And in an online, the feedback loop for that is very quick and very clear. And the language around that, some people are known as link droppers or link baiters, and that in order to become acculturated to the community, you have to give feedback first to others and participate in a discussion with others before you can just pop a question or post a question and have others pay attention to you. So I think that feedback loop is quite clear, but maybe Elise, you have.
Well, so I'm sort of interested too in you introduced the idea of play.
Yeah.
So we have the sense, of course, that we're part of lots of different cultures.
Mm-hmm.
So the factor and exponential analysis, we're actually nested in many different cultures, and we get to create new cultures. Play lets us do that. I mean, so when we're in a play space, we get to like hold off the boundaries of other spaces and create something together. It's like an iterative testing, what if kind of space. And in some ways, digital media let us do that with putting on in different kinds of identities and testing things and seeing how people react. And we probably don't do enough of that kind of creating a play space in order to see if we can create new patterns of interaction. One of the things that was interesting to me, another place to listen, and actually what triggered it was when you used the word lurk. Mm-hmm. So lurkers, I mean, we all know what that is in an online space, right? You're a lurker because you haven't been participating. There was a time in the writing project, and actually I think it was Shirley Brown, a great Philadelphia teacher, now retired, who did this. We were creating some online discussions among educators around the country, and people were worried about the folks who were lurking. And as a teacher, she said, well, you know, what are they doing? They're actually spending a lot of time reading. Would we think about them differently if we said, what about the readers? Like, what if in our room we had people who were really reading everything intensively and maybe not saying as much, but we would maybe value that, because over here maybe there's someone who's saying a lot and actually not reading much. So why are we calling them lurkers when they're readers? And then everybody just got really playful with that idea, and it shifted the way we thought about participation, away from a kind of glibness to how do we appreciate thoughtfulness and make space for that. So the way we talk about anything is actually a huge part of the frame, the way we talk about education. One of the things about listening I wonder about that people probably wouldn't use the word listening for is listening sort of historically and across time. The books that Melinda mentioned, I would absolutely echo, are 3 essentials. And an interesting thing about those books is they're not new.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not new because they're part of a long tradition of the kind of work that people, for example, were talking about with great engagement and passion yesterday in the session on talking through race. And I forget the title of the session, Jose's and other sessions.
Privileged voices.
Privileged voices, thank you. And even that, there's an example, the knapsack of privilege. So and then before that, there's the Carter G. Woodsons. And before that, there's a long history to this conversation about schooling and culture. One of the things that's interesting to me, in the room, there are people who were leaders in previous waves of reform, like let's say in the 90s. I participated in that in the city of Baltimore, where I was at that time. Philadelphia was part of that. Educators trying to think about this exact issue at different social moments. One of the things I'm curious about is how much we're encouraged to think about these issues in that context by listening to the voices of previous generations, maybe who are now older and amongst us but still here, maybe who have passed, whose works are here through reading, and feel that we're part of a different cultural tradition, a cultural tradition of trying to make a certain kind of change. Does that change the way we think about the culture dynamic? Does it change if we say something like, wow, maybe if we don't focus only on what's new, digital media, everything has changed, information age, schools have to change, the future is different, they're part of a completely changing economy. Does that everything is new conversation, which I know I've advanced, I've been part of, does that lead us to stop looking at our ancestors in another element of change who have great wisdom to give us about the relationship between schools and or philosophy? I mean, one of the things that's always fascinating to me about schools when I now do work with, and parents are part of it, or other community educators in libraries and museums and small CBOs and out-of-school youth media programs, things like that. When we talk about schools as a system, if we talk about education, right now we're talking about it almost entirely in relationship to the economy. And that's really advancing the conversation. It's doing some positive things by giving us some resources for certain kinds of change. It's doing a lot of negative things by completely encapsulating schools in their instrumental economic impact. It's neglecting things like citizenship, for example, and civic engagement. But it's also kind of forgetting the central tension, I think, about schools. Like, schools are the way that at this moment in this society and most societies that have school systems, that young people are socialized to leave this cocoon of their family
And go out in the world.
and go into the world. They are an engine for people to grow up into the world. It's so profound and it's so human. And of course, it's the drama of families, communities, and society, which have been playing out in ancient ways again and again. Why wouldn't we assume that there are going to be tensions and things to work through and patterns between this institution and its community? How can we forget to talk about that? It has to be because we're only seeing the market, or we're only seeing the economy, and we're only seeing one part of this equation.
Right.
So what we talk about when we talk about education is huge. And if we only talk about technology or jobs, as critical as they are, or best practice, as if it's about moves we make within the bounded space of a classroom,
Right.
are we really talking about what our lives are about as professionals in an institution like schooling?
And I appreciate that point, because I think that that's a question I also have. We are more connected than ever, to the point of paralysis, I feel sometimes. And so, we're inundated with all this information, and it's new, and we have these historic voices. So how do you identify those profound connections in your digital and IRL communities? So maybe
I can
Go
pick
ahead.
up on what Elise
Sure.
said. I think that you're absolutely right, and I think there is a big gap between one accessing historical information that is relevant to students. But there's also a big gap in being able to maximize the community and bringing them into the school as resources. I think that what I have seen as a parent is a real resistance to teaching racial and social justice in the classroom, which would bridge exactly what you're talking about. And you mentioned the session yesterday. One of the pieces that came out of that was that there was kind of, I don't want to say a fear, but there was an apprehension about kind of where do we start? Where do we begin? And I really feel as though when the priority is put on this is hard, that it then becomes a matter of elevating an adult's discomfort over what a student and a child really needs.
That's right.
And there are so many resources, because I was a little vocal at that session yesterday, and I was kind of nudged afterwards to provide some resources. So I did my homework, and I would say, number one, read Ta-Nehisi Coates. Read him, study him, put him under your pillow, sleep on it, take it out, read it again. There are resources right in this room. Bob Dylan, if he's here, spoke at the NCND yesterday. He's in Missouri. He's done a lot of really great work around reflections and the response around Ferguson. He's a resource to you right in this room. Jamie Gravel was at the NCND yesterday. She did a piece on critical race theory and what she would have liked to have known before she went into the classroom. Zach Chase wrote this most profound post on what were we teaching Darren Wilson. These are all great resources to really get a handle around how you talk and begin to talk and begin to grapple and wrestle with these kinds of issues. But I guess my charge to you is do it. You're gonna mess up, you're gonna make mistakes, you're gonna stumble. You're teachers, you're educators, right? What would you tell your students? Would you say, don't do this, don't ever try? No, you wouldn't. So I'm asking you to kind of model the exact same principles that you bring to your class.
Yes.
Just to add to the conversation, another aspect of my philosophical approach with how I treat schools or learning spaces is, like, my number one priority. If someone said, well, what do you do? I said, is create a safe place. Safety is number one for me. And people think, oh, well, because you're at South Philadelphia High School and they used to be persistently dangerous and you have, I said, no, when I was a principal at a suburban district, safety still number one. One, safety is important, and you will find out the moment that it's compromised that it will take over your world. It will take over your world, so you must always consider safety. But it's not limited to just physical safety. It's emotional safety. It's creating such a safe environment that you have those risk takers. So, you know, if you read the piece on my bio, and it's something that I wrote, and I'm modifying, you know, my philosophical statement all the time, but one of the key words or statements in there is creating a safe environment for risk taking. So whether it be a student, a teacher, so if it is that young, you know, African-American student that wants to be in the high school musical, but that's not cool because, you know, the black kids, we don't do that. If a kid feels like they can't do that, there's something wrong in that you have created in that space that kid doesn't feel safe enough to do so. You know, the young girl that doesn't want to take AP math because girls don't do that. Who says? Why? If you are a teacher and you create a safe enough environment where everyone feels encouraged and supported and that young lady can do it, that's what you want to create. So if you can create that for not just students, but also teachers that can come to you. So I try to encourage my teachers, please come to me with ideas. Don't tell yourself no, let me tell you no. But develop it. Develop an idea, let me go back, and I'm telling you now, I'm going to ask you 20 questions. You're going to think I'm about to tell you no, but I'm just vetting it and making sure you thought it all the way through. But don't, bring it to me. Take that risk, and the thing is, I'll let you try it. Go for it. Just now, how are we going to measure it? We got to make sure, you know, it's valid, and is it, you know, research-based or whatever. Coming from. But how are we going to make sure that this works? But you have to create a safe enough environment that students feel encouraged and safe enough. They have that emotional support that they need, or in the intellectual safety. I mean, it's all of those different aspects that, once again, as the educator in the room, whether you have 30 kids in front of you, 20 kids, or whatever, you create that space. And so if you have kids that are shy and when you change the language from lurking to the reader, right, now you created a little safe, now I feel a little safer saying something. Just with that one shift, it creates a whole new paradigm shift. Like, yeah, I have been absorbing all that. I just didn't know when I could jump in the conversation. Now you just opened the door, and I feel safe, and I feel supported to give my opinion. And if you can create that environment in a classroom, because I tell a teacher, any teacher should be able to create that in any classroom, in any school. I don't care where you are, in the hardest part of the city, whatever. You can do that. If you can create that, you can make magic and do really special things with your kids. And there's so many different examples from either people sitting in this room that because you're the all-star in your building and people are wondering why it works. It's because I create a safe enough environment where my kids actually try. They're not scared to fail. They just go for it. And then people are like, how do you get so much out of your kids? Because they know that if they sweat really hard, it's not going to kill them. I got their back. I'm going to help them. But it's safe for them to take that risk.
Great, thank you. Vanessa, you want to chime in?
Yes, I wanted to pull together several threads. I wanted to talk about the safety, the designing for safety, and a little bit about designing for new environments, online environments. Ironically, I'm like the biggest Luddite ever. I check my phone like 3 times a day. And so when people talk a lot about online environments and it being so different, I am really honest about the fact that I take all of my lessons basically from nature and church. Nature, church, AA, the SEIU, none of this shit is new. So in community design, to build a safe community, you need to start with your first 10 and distribute the behavior that you're going to model with in the classroom case, your teachers, right, and your teacher assistants, teaching assistants. But in order to seed this sense of safety, you can't do it by yourself. You need to have a crew. And you need to be able to trust the other people in the room that you have the same sense of decorum and the same sense of what's in and what's out. So yeah, I always start with my first 10. And then when we're building these online communities, and Elise and I have done it together and tangentially and observed each other, a matrix or a metric of success when you're doing the community building online is observe who is asking for help. That means that they feel safe. Observe who is saying, I have no idea, WTF, what's going on. Because they assume that there's someone in the room that will help them. And that to me is where we've succeeded in building these profound connections between people. So when I'm doing my qualitative analysis after we're done with a project, I look for how many people sort of laid their souls bare. And then the third piece about building profound connections online and safety is looking for chances when people are spinning off. And you guys will see this in the classroom too, when people have decided to build their own subculture, it means that they're really safe. PDPU has built this thing called Course in a Box, and what it allows you to do is if you don't know where the course is going, you fork it and you build your own. And sub-communities are good, and sub-communities are awesome, and they mean that we've built the most safe thing. Is there anything else I wanted to say about that? No, I think I'm good.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, I wonder if we could switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about creating safe spaces for the learners, for the students, and maybe how to develop space for connectedness among student body. And obviously you've done that at your school to bring these cultures together. So maybe you could each speak a little bit about ways we can help our learners to be connected, or if we need to, or if we just need to open a pathway for them and let them run with it. We talked a little bit about the connected learning pathway. I don't want to talk about that, or anybody?
Yeah, well, I
else
think that access is never enough, because simply opening up access will advantage those who know what to do with it and can act on it, and will not assist those for whom that is a challenge. And we're seeing that absolutely in every element right now. online learning experience. I think one of the things that, for any of us that have been part of this movement toward digital media and learning, let's say, one of the most disturbing things that we have to wrestle with is that the equity gap is growing. Not the digital divide we used to talk about who has access to internet, high-speed internet. That's still an issue, and we should continue to work on it. We should look at things like how the FCC is trying to affect that, at least in this nation. Mm-hmm. But what we're seeing is a huge growing gap that is economic. And as an economic gap, it will actually exacerbate issues around race and culture because of the way that people are distributed in the economy. But families that are able to take advantage of the growing, proliferating set of learning opportunities online are taking advantage of it for their young people. They're spending more the data on their income expenditures for alternative learning environments and enrichment programs for their kids are growing. Low-income parents are also growing their expenditure for enrichment activities, but the ratio between them is expanding. So in fact, we do have this issue. It's a classic issue in progressive education that it actually is something that some families know better how to take advantage of. So without a proactive corrective, which is about not just opening access, but actually working on creating meaningful connection to a range of high value learning opportunities that are rich and advance young people, without a kind of corrective for that, we don't get to, I think that's huge. And one other piece I would say, though, that's a little different bit, and it's actually about creating safety, which you were mentioning. This is maybe going to sound like I've just put the lens in the wrong place, but a phrase that I love that I heard once from a principal who actually had it as a sign in her office long ago: feed the teachers so that they don't eat the kids. Right? Now, I just want, like, and I think it could be, feed the community organizers so that they don't eat the community, feed the live, I think there's a feed the social worker. So I think that is unbelievably huge because, first off, because but you can't really deeply create safety, I think, in a building, in a classroom, unless there's some interior work as well. And a lot of people have looked at, for example, teacher culture. We haven't talked about teacher culture. Teachers, we have a culture, we know that, right? Because you'll see patterns, you'll say, oh, that's teachers, that's how they do. Just like that's teacher culture. People have looked at professions like teaching, like social work. A book like The Managed Heart, which looks at the culture of flight attendants, might seem like a big stretch, but if you think about flight attendants are always on, always on. Their tool for their work is mostly their self. The way they project a being out socially. A passenger is nervous. How do you comfort them? People won't sit down, and we've got to sit down. So how do we get them to sit? How do we manage the environment? And this study looked at the huge, exhausting nature of that type of work. Teaching is that type of work too. We get exhausted. We need to help each other get through the face work of just doing our profession, so that actually we can be more present for each other and that we can actually not eat the kids. Not try to be the coolest teacher in the building. One thing that I worry a little bit about in change processes is when, and it could be any of us, it could be me at a moment, when you're so grooving on being the one who's out in front and it's pretty cool and the kids are all following you and that sort of thing. What are you doing to the environment that helps create an entire building where all the teachers are experienced as really powerful and engaging and care about us? Or, so that happens to the early adopter a little bit, and that's something we have to critique on that side. And then what happens to the person who is just really afraid to make a change, and so they've ground themselves into their resistance? It's a principled resistance. How do we break that? How do we do that? And that's your whole life. And you're on the right side of an argument at one point, and the wrong side a little bit later. So how do we do that for each other? How do we build a professional culture to try and bring the best out in each other as colleagues over the long term, not just around this issue today, but over the very long term of our interactions with each other and with young people and with the community and with parents and with other educators like librarians or museum educators or the CBOs that sometimes we like to lord it over because we're teachers and the ones with degrees. But when you talk to kids, they say, wow, the most powerful person in my life is this mentor or this coach or this librarian. How do we bring them in the conversation? So there's a lot of self-work and professional culture work that I think is part of this too,
Yeah,
in
absolutely.
creating safety for kids.
And I would also say, what does that look like specifically, and who can spearhead this in your community? So, you know, anyone want to chime in on what that looks like? We've got that.
Well, it's kind of fascinating to me just listening to how everyone kind of, where they come at these questions, because that isn't something I actually thought about until I heard you speaking, and that is really profound. I guess when I heard the question about connections and students, my mind immediately went to teachers of color, because I feel as though that is an area where we are really lacking in education, and there are such important connections that are made when you have students that are now more than 50% students of color, and a profession that is 80% plus white, and growing, right? And I think, as I mentioned to you yesterday, there's a quote from Junot Diaz, the Spanish poet, and he talks about windows and mirrors, and he talked about it in terms of his writing and why he became a writer, because he wanted Hispanic children to see authors like him who could reflect his experience. But I think about it also in terms of education, because I think about what messages are we sending to students of color about authority, about power, when the only people they see in front of them don't look like them. So and this carries over into how this safety issue, I believe, I think it carries over into how students view schooling, how much they view schools as a safe place, a welcoming place. And it's something that I feel that it's something I've experienced because I've written on it. And I read the comments. I know I'm not supposed to, but I do. And the comments are just incredible to me whenever I write anything about the need for more teachers of color. There's this immediate pushback that any teacher can teach any child, and that race should not be the prism through which we seek out quality teachers. But I look at it the reverse, in that being able to relate to a child and having that cultural identity is a quality. That's something that we should look at as being a quality that is sought after in hiring teachers. That's not to say that a teacher cannot teach a child of color. What it is to say is that, think about a school in reverse, where the majority of the students were white and the teachers were of color. What would be the reaction? Would we be as passive and as docile about that condition? I don't think so, if it ever occurred. So I think that it's a dynamic that I feel is really critical in terms of students really being able to connect and see themselves in a role that is so critical for them. I think about my education. I think I maybe had 2 teachers of color, like from the time I went through kindergarten to 12th grade. My son is now in 9th grade, and he's gotten really funny because, you know, every time he goes to school, I'm always like, how many teachers of color do you have now? And he's just like, oh, Mom. But I'm just, because it's just something that I'm just very, I'm very in tune to. And, you know, when I get together with other parents that look like me, we're all very in tune to it. And it's something that we seek out, but we don't necessarily see being made a priority in terms of policy or recruitment.
I feel like at the risk of jumping in, I think this issue is so critical. And it's not an issue of individual excellence. A teacher, a school with an all-white faculty, each of whom is individually excellent, will still send the message that school is white, that it is a learning institution that is about white. And it will create a dynamic, even if every single solitary teacher is individually excellent. So we absolutely have to take this up. And as we're doing that, if we can reverse this direction, because actually we do not have a pipeline, and we are not recruiting and keeping up a substantial number of teachers of color into the profession. So as we work to, I hope, turn that around, that's where sometimes these community partners are absolutely critical, because in some of these other learning spaces, that is where you're going to see actually a more diverse set of mentors and connectors for young people who should be engaged with such a way, not that they serve the school, not that the school is their master, and what can you do to help us educate young people, like schools own education. The society owns education. Well, how can we work together is a different frame for that. But these other connecting partners are critical. That's where you're going to find the mentors that young people often look to. So this is a hugely critical issue, and we should, I think, examine a lot of the ed reform proposals that we see being floated, or the ways, the pathways by which people come into the profession. And among the many questions we would ask, like, will teachers come out of that prepared? I mean, there's a lot of kind of classic questions we ask, but we should also ask, what would be the impact on our desire to recruit more teachers of color? That should be an automatic question on the list that we would use as a policy screen when people talk about changes to the profession, entry to the profession, all of those kinds of things.
Thank you. Do you want to chime in, Vanessa? I was going to ask, just on piggybacking on the idea of encouraging more connectedness among learners, among teachers. Could you speak maybe a little bit about how maybe some changes you made when coming on board?
Well, I guess I view it as in terms of, if I think of life as a highway, and for some students, they need life is a highway, right? But some students, they don't know where the entry ramp is. And they don't know that, and sometimes, that entry ramp to what they want to do puts them right in on the fast lane. And they don't know if they have enough horsepower to even jump out there. And so as a principal, my job is to create those entry ramps. I need to figure out a way for you to get in on that. And then what supports do you need in order to do it? So, example, something that I'm working on right now for my school. We know that school districts are cutting, arts and music and everything. I haven't had a music teacher for the last 4 years at South Philadelphia High School, which, if you're familiar with South Philadelphia High School, one of the richest music programs against almost any school you can touch. And so what I'm working on right now is, I'll put it this way. When I talk to people, I always know whatever my top 3 things, big ideas I have, when I'm talking to people, especially that are either well-connected or well-funded, I tell them my ideas. And one of them, I want a music program. And so, I have a partnership with Wells Fargo, and they had a conversation with one of the organizations they support, is the Curtis Institute of Music. If you know Curtis, that's big time stuff. Well, a bunch of students from Curtis were in my building on MLK Day painting and redoing my music room. But the next connecting piece that I told him, I said, this is just this is actually the icing. We haven't actually did the cake yet. The cake is getting students from Curtis coming to my school, music to my students. And they're on board with that. So now we have to we have the ingredients, now we just have to put it all together to make it work. But that's how I'm going to get my students connected to. Now, will my students all of a sudden pick up an instrument in 9th grade and end up at Curtis? Probably not. But can they pick up an instrument in 9th grade and develop a passion for music and learning? And then also, does that hit those other aspects of the brain that helps them learn how to learn? Because I'm thinking about my learning in a new way that, the music and the arts, which it covers, but our kids don't get that aspect when you take music and art out of schools. That's how some students, that's how they learn how to learn. because that hit them, and now I can transfer that learning to now my math class and English class, because now I know how to study, and I know that I need to practice. But they have to see that. So my job in terms of connecting the dots for them is creating the entry ramp, developing the relationship, and then you still have to identify the right people in your building to nurture it. Mm-hmm. So like right now, everyone knows, like I told, Dr. Height to whomever, I need the right music teacher for my school now, because I said, I'm gonna have an awesome thing set up for you, and you better not blow it. That's what I'm gonna tell them in the interview, like, look, if I have this relationship set up for you, I'm telling you now, you better not blow this. You better make it work. But as a principal, you should want to hear that when you're sitting in an interview, because if you have that skill set, awesome, this is where I want to be. Because I want a teacher I want that person to look at me and say, you know what, this is where I want to be. And if they like look at me and their eyes glaze over a little bit and I can tell that they're a little apprehensive, can't do that, because my kids I need the right person to do this. And so it's connecting it, creating the safe environment, but you got to build it up and putting them in the right room with the right people. And then hopefully that helps develop that relationship. And and one of the things that was like special even on that day, speaking of like the racial dynamic, was there was this young brother from Atlanta, first year student at Curtis. He said, whatever you need, call me. He said, I'll get here. And so now I have to figure out how am I going to incorporate this young guy into something that we're trying to do here. Either it's because I don't have all the equipment yet to get him going to start working with kids. So how are we going to do it? So, my brain is churning and I'm trying to figure out how am I going to incorporate this. But he said to me, Jed, I'll be here. Mm-hmm. So how do I make that work? Because I just met a young person who already has it, that giving spirit that I want to give back, because he said someone put this instrument in my hand and I need to pass that on. That does matter. I know, I tell folks all the time, I was a teacher at Germantown High School, I was a math teacher and the boys varsity basketball coach. I know my race and gender had something to do with my success, but that wasn't the only aspect. Everyone knew I was a tough teacher. I was the guy that actually taught every Friday. I taught the day before a holiday. And they were like, oh God, you're the only guy teaching. You say, you are right, because I'm here at work, so we're gonna work. But it was developing the relationship with the students, but that relatability. So, when they're making a reference to something, I'm jumping right in on the reference, like, you're not gonna say something to my class that gets by me from the latest song on the radio. Like, no, I know what you're talking about. But now let's get back to being focused on what we need to do, but I never dismissed it. And so there's certain aspects, and I can tell you as a student that struggled in high school, and it wasn't because of my, intellectual capacity, I just didn't relate to the culture I was in at that time. I look back on it and I said, man, I really blew some opportunities. But I didn't feel like, that at times that I was wanted, welcomed, or whatever, what I brought to the table wasn't embraced, or because I didn't have the knowledge background of some other kids, I wasn't respected. And so, when you constantly hear teachers say, oh, they don't have the background knowledge to do this, they don't have the background knowledge, well then, who's going to give it to them? That's your job. They don't know how to do something, it's your job to teach them. That's why they are here. If they knew everything walking in the door, actually, everyone, they don't need us. If they knew everything they needed to know walking in the door, they don't need us. I always cringe when I hear folks, well, they don't have the background knowledge to do that. Well, how do you embed the background knowledge? What they need to, for what you need to cover right now, how do you embed that into it? Think back on what you need to do that. But you need to be able to relate and understand the kids. And the racial piece is a really powerful piece to me. And I remember I was dealing with some other issues before, and all you got to do is kind of switch it up. And I hate the little corny movie Time to Kill or whatever, but there was a line in there. He said, like, imagine if she were white. But I always imagine, imagine if it were a girl. When you think about gender inequity, some of the things that we talked about, if you substitute racial inequities in teachers, so if you had a school with majority of girls, but all the teachers were male. What? What do you mean? All of a sudden it's like, oh, clear, oh yeah, you're right. We need to get more female teachers in there. We say something about, I don't care, and like I said, I have a very diverse school. I have 19 different languages in my school. So I'm looking for diversity. I'm looking for people that look like my kids, because if it's just one person they can go and talk to in their native language, it's for them, that's good. Mm-hmm. At that point of the day, they might get 1 point in the day. That's why, when we talk about kids sitting in a lunchroom together, that might be the only point in the day they can actually sit around and talk to each other in their own language. And even if it's English, but it's like West Philly English, this is when we're going to talk. Because when I'm in my classroom and I'm the only one, I just, it's work, and folks don't realize it is. And if you don't feel like putting in the work, my folks at Springfield, I love them to death, but when I'm there, I knew I was under a microscope. I was the first black principal in the school district. They had another administrator, but I was the first black principal, and I'm the principal of the high school. I was under, it was work, constantly. People were checking, your grammar all the time. They're ready to correct you, your tone, intonation, everything. And it's just like, not to say what does it do with how I can lead the school, but you're constantly under a microscope. So, but if you just flip it sometimes, you just say, well, what if it was a gender issue? And because folks know we've had that battle before, and if we look at girls are going to college at a higher rate than boys now. They've worked. Now, there's still some work to be done with getting more girls into the sciences or into STEM-related fields and everything like that, fixing, the salary gap at that level. But in terms of things that were done to address the gender inequality, people said, okay, yeah, we need to fix it because that was their daughter.
Right.
And they didn't want that for their daughter.
Right.
And those are two things. I don't want to get into the whatever.
And we're
but
almost,
when you think
we're
of
pretty
two
much out of
things,
time. I'm sorry.
I know. All right.
Sorry
Okay.
to say
I'll
that.
stop.
Do you want
I know.
to summarize,
No,
please?
you can go.
But I can't believe we're out of time. That just went so quickly, and we have so much more to talk about. But we have another whole day ahead of us to keep the conversations going. Thank you so much to our panelists. Terrific conversation. Thank you to all of them. Great job. And so please, make more connections and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
All right, folks, if you are a presenter.